Hello everybody and welcome back to this series on Docker where we're discussing the Dockerfile. In this particular series we've had a few videos on Dockerfile, and in the last video we built our Dockerfile and we got a container up and running with the basics for having the ability to SSH into our container using this as our example. So let's continue where we left off, and we're going to go ahead and modify our Dockerfile, update the build, and finish the process. Okay, so I'm going to exit out of this container. I'm going to do an up arrow. I'm going to change the Docker run and add a detached mode. So this will still run my Docker container in interactive mode with a terminal running the bash shell, but it'll do it detached. And here we are. If I do a Docker PS, you can see my container is running. Now, quick note here. Why would I run interactive and in terminal mode when I'm detached? Why do I want to do that? And the reason why is because if I want to attach to this container later, I need it to be interactive and I need to have that terminal. Continuing on, I'm going to clear the screen. I'm going to do a Docker execute against my SSH server container, which we named SSH server. And the command I'm going to run is to cat/etc ssh sshd_config. And I'm going to pipe that into sshd_config, the same name. And I'm going to hit enter. Let that complete. And now if I do a directory listing, I have my sshd config file that we can manipulate and configure our SSH. Bringing back up my window, my Explorer window, I now have that SSH config file. So I'll go ahead and open that with code. And from my video on configuring an SSHD server inside of a Docker container, I opened up port 8022 instead of port 22 because it's more secure to run on a port that's above 1024. So really all I want to do to this file for this particular video, I'm not going to go into depth on SSH configuration or anything like that, but I just want to be able to open up the port 8022 for access. So I'm going to save that file. So let's go back to our Docker file, and we're going to add another copy command, and that's going to be our SSHD config file, and we're going to place it in the etc ssh sshd config file. So we're just going to take the file from our local directory that we can now manipulate and change as we need when we're building this container, and I'm going to pop it inside of this container. Now, also in the video on how to build an SSH server, I was really talking more towards a real server and using a container as an example. But we don't need the uncomplicated firewall, because the uncomplicated firewall should probably be on the actual host system protecting the Docker engine, and you should be configuring it at that level versus here at the container level. So I'm going to take it out of here to make this container a little bit more lean, and we can save this out. So the next thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and change this just a little bit, and I'm going to, instead of copying the public key directly into the .ssh in my root, I'm going to add it directly into the authorized-keys file, and this will allow this key to be authorized by the server. So later on, I can go ahead and issue a command to append another key to the authorized-keys file, which will allow me to authorize other private keys to access this server. So the next thing that we need to do is we need to make sure that the SSH server is running. So at this point, we want to issue an entry point, which we also learned. Now, entry point utilizes the ability, if you can look here, even it gives you a hint, to place a command and what we want the parameter to be, which in this case, something like this. However, in our case, we're not doing an executable in that way. We're issuing a direct command to the entry point. So what we're going to do is we're just going to say service SSH start without the shell executable capabilities in there. And then I'm also going to do an ampersand to say, I also want you to run the bash command. So what this is going to do is it's going to start the SSH server and then automatically at instantiation start up the bash shell. That way I don't have to issue the command at the end of my Docker run statement every single time. Usually we're used to doing Docker run, the name of the container, and then the command that we want to run. But here we're actually telling it, hey, start the SSH server and then start bash. So let's try that out. I'll issue a save here, minimize, and we're back at the Ubuntu host shell to issue our commands. So the very first thing that we'll do is we'll do a docker ps-a just to make sure we don't have any running or stopped containers. We need to rebuild our Docker container image because we've changed the Dockerfile. So I'll go ahead and do a Docker build. Target is going to be my SSH server on 1.0. I'm not really going to change the version because we're still building this out. So this is still technically our first version. And I'm going to execute the location of where I would like Docker to find my Dockerfile. So I hit enter, and you'll see here that this time when we run this, and I'll wait for it to finish, you'll see that we utilized our cache to build this container, and it only took 12 seconds. So from here, we now have our new Docker image. So let's clear this out. Issuing a Docker image is here. You'll see the my SSH server is ready to go. So what we'll do now is, as I did before, I'll go back just so that we can have a little bit more room to work with while keeping the screen fonts a little bit bigger. So I'm going to do a Docker run. I'm going to execute an interactive terminal. I'm going to do it in detached mode. I'm going to name it SSH server. I'm going to publish port 8022 to port 8022 on my container, from my host to my container. I'm going to start up the my SSH server, and I'm going to hit enter. Let's wait for this to end. As you can see, what did I do wrong? I forgot the tag, so it doesn't know where to find this. I'll kill it, and I'll issue the tag at the end, and that should work. Okay. And we now have this container up and running. It's called SSH_server, and we are ready to see whether or not our SSH server is up and running. So I'm going to do, let's clear the screen, SSH-I ID RSA root at localhost on port 8022. It's now asking me to put in my passphrase, which we did in the beginning of the video. I hit enter, and I'm in our server, and we're good to go. So I can exit out of that server, docker ps-a, and you'll see even though I exited out, I still have this server up and running, because unlike before when we attach to the server and do an exit, so we would actually be on the instance directly, we would have exited out completely. Here, I'm in a separate SSH session, so I can exit out cleanly without stopping the container. I'm going to go ahead and end this video at this point. And in the next video, I'll go ahead and expand on this particular container just a little bit more to add a couple of more different commands in there to just advance our knowledge. I want to thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed this. Please like and subscribe, and I'll see you in the next video.